Tonight we're in St Austell, and welcome to Question Time. Welcome's all round. Welcome to you at home. Welcome to our audience here who'll be putting the questions, and to our panel who don't know those questions until they hear them from the audience's lips. The Conservative Matthew Hancock, former advisor to George Osborne, now a business minister promoted in the last reshuffle. Labour's Shadow Work and Pensions Minister Chris Bryant. The Liberal Democrat MP sacked by Nick Clegg in the reshuffle earlier this month, Jeremy Browne. Harriet Sargent, who spent 3 years hanging out with gang members to write her book Among the Hoods, and the campaigner for the rights of people who've changed their gender, recently named the most influential person in the independent newspaper's Pink List, Paris Lees. And Steve White has our first question. Mr. White.
How will spending £40 billion on HS2 benefit taxpayers in rural communities such as Cornwall?
Rural communities such as Cornwall, HS2, which has had its initial stages of financing agreed today. Chris Bryant.
I don't suppose it will directly, but I think we've got to look bigger. We've got to look at what it does for the whole of the country, because if there's one thing that I think is wrong about the economy in this country, it is that it is far too focused on London and the southeast of England. We need to stretch that economic prosperity if there is going to be growth now, or is it far too late and all the rest of it, but if there is going to be growth now, it's got to stretch beyond that tiny little patch of London and the southeast. Apart from anything else, in the interest of the people who live in London and the southeast, because in areas like here, or in my constituency in South Wales in the Rhondda, where you have literally dozens of people applying for a job, there aren't jobs to go to. People are being encouraged to move to places where there are jobs, but they can't afford to live there because the house prices in London and the South East are going through the roof. So my argument is HS2, I really want it to happen. I want to shrink the country, but it can't just be spend 42 billion and give a blank cheque. I worry that £14 billion of that, a third of the money, is actually the contingency. So I think we've been absolutely right to say there's no blank cheque here. We've got to push down on the figures, and we've got to make sure this isn't just a train, great big train set for ministers to play with. It's actually about transforming the economy of this country.
Matthew Hancock, is there evidence, apparently there is, in the Transport Department, that HS2 will actually take jobs from places like Cornwall, rural parts of Britain, because they'll go to the narrow channel that HS2 creates north and south in the country?
No, because HS2 is part of a national infrastructure plan. I agree with a lot of what Chris said, and in fact I welcome the passion with which he said it, because HS2 is important, but it's important as part of a larger plan. For those who worry, like here in St Austell, that we aren't investing in other places around the country, HS2 will only take about a quarter, just under a quarter of the budget for transport, and it connects our biggest cities. But that means that 3/4 of the spending is available on transport for everywhere else in the country. For instance, there's upgrades happening on the line from here to London, and in my constituency in West Suffolk and elsewhere around the country. So we've got to make sure that we sort out this long-term problem that there hasn't been enough infrastructure, and HS2 is part of that, but only as part of a national plan that makes sure everywhere is better connected.
Can you clarify one thing? Is it coming straight out of the pocket of the taxpayer, or is most of this money actually going to be met by government bonds being issued? In other words, that the actual damage to the exchequer is much less than would appear at first sight. Well, has this been decided?
The amount that is paid for by the taxpayer obviously has to be raised, and ultimately, even if it's borrowed, it has to be paid for. You know, one of the things we've learnt over the last few years is you can't just borrow on the never-never as a country. But of course, part of it will be paid for also by people paying to go on the line once it's completed.
That's my point. So that it won't necessarily come straight out, all 42 billion, of these people's pockets. It'll be paid for by future profits. Is that the plan? Because if that is the plan, why haven't you made that clear? Because it would change the argument.
Well, part of it will be paid for by people who are by the passengers, but part of it is about spending, infrastructure spending.
Right.
But it's got to be part of increasing spending on infrastructure to improve our infrastructure to every part of the country.
OK. Man in the second row from the back there.
Are you going to privatise it?
Well,
eventually.
It'll be built as part by an awful lot of companies and the state. So, you know, in a sense, how do you build things in this country? You get people in to build them. The Olympics were built by hundreds of private companies, employing people locally, employing people all around Britain. So, you know, we've got to make sure that it's built in the most cost-effective manner possible.
Harriet Sargent.
Well, I think the gentleman who asked this question originally asked exactly the right question. And I think that the HS2, unfortunately, is an example of what is going wrong today in politics. I mean, for a start, was the lack of transparency, that the report that came out, and it was only through a special, asking a special investigation that we actually found out that the government had suppressed the information, that there are 50 areas in the country which are not just not going to benefit from HS2, but are actually going to be worse off. And one of those is Cornwall. And in fact, the Cornish economy is going to be £20 million worse off. So, you know, this is, again, just something that seems to be benefiting London businessmen so that they can get somewhere quicker.
Jeremy Browne, as a West Country MP, do you concur with what Harriet said?
No, I take completely the opposite view. I don't think it will benefit everywhere in the country equally, but then no infrastructure ever does. Unless the train goes to absolutely every town in the country, it's obviously going to have a disproportionate benefit. But then so does dualling the A30 in Cornwall have a disproportionate benefit for people in this area. But the reason I support HS2 is because I think it is absolutely crucial to our future economic prosperity as a country that we have a massive uplift in our infrastructure and our ability to transport people, goods and services to market and between cities faster than we do at the moment. And let me make two quick points. One is an historical point. There were lots of naysayers when Brunel built the first tunnel under the Thames and people saying, well, you know, we've managed perfectly well with boats for hundreds of years. This is all a waste of money. It's a vanity project. No doubt when the M1 was built, it said, oh, you know, there's lots of people protesting. But if we didn't have a motorway network, our country would be in a much worse position than it is in terms of our society, but also our economy. And my second is a global point. If you go to countries like China, what is very striking is the massive, massive infrastructure investment that is happening in airports, in high-speed rail, in motorway capacity. Now, they're either doing that because they're stupid and they have a wish to waste their money, or possibly, and my view is this, they're doing it because they realise that in order to be globally competitive, they need to have a modern infrastructure. And a lot of our infrastructure dates back from the Victorian era, and I want us to have a can-do spirit in this country, not a can't-do spirit, and make sure that we have infrastructure fit for the next 100 years.
Very briefly. Yeah. Jeremy, very briefly, did you accept the figure that Harriet used, which was KPMG accountants, FOI, Freedom of Information, from the department, that Cornwall will be £20 million worse off?
I think those,
is that wrong?
I think those figures are hard to quantify. I think that to a degree they're plucked from the air.
Okay.
But I think it's in the national... If we're a more prosperous country, we will raise more revenue to pay for public services in Cornwall and everywhere else in the country.
The woman up there on the right in green. The woman there on the right, please.
We're not arguing against HS2. What we're saying is there isn't enough infrastructure across the rest of the country.
Absolutely.
And maybe the priority now needs to be not HS2, but other places that haven't got any infrastructure in place.
Paris Leeds.
Absolutely. I'm a Nottingham girl, and actually, Harriet, it's not just going to benefit London businessmen. I think I read in the paper today that it's going to boost the economy of Nottingham by 5%, and I think that what the lady said is quite right. We should be doing that all over the country. And actually, the French have had high-speed rail since before I was born. They've been travelling at 200 miles per hour since 1981. I'm surprised they're not all dizzy. And I just think, why can't we do that in this country? You know, so it's not about can we do HS2. Of course, we can do anything if we put our mind to it. Let's do it properly, and let's get it around the rest of the country as well.
Can we...
Sorry, can I just say briefly, just to follow on, that what's embarrassing is how long we took to get HS1 to happen. So in France, you were going at 200 miles an hour from Paris to the tunnel, or 160 miles an hour under the tunnel, and then 30 miles an hour in Britain.
But Chris,
of course, you've got to transform all of that.
But Chris, in order to make sure that these things actually happen, given that it's going to take a long time to build, we've got to make sure, if you believe it, that major parties stay on side, as well as for infrastructure to everywhere else. You know, passenger numbers are already at capacity. They're set to double.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Are you complaining about Labour's position?
So why aren't Labour more...
making a party political
I'm making
why shouldn't he?
that if we're going to build infrastructure, we need parties who say they support it actually to get out there and support it and vote for it.
Do you believe Labour supports it or not?
I certainly hope so, but there've been
do you believe so?
No, there've been a lot of wobbles.
They're playing games.
Well, you're all playing games because you're making it a party political thing. Do you think it's a good idea or you don't? What's that got to do with political ideology?
Let me... Look, two people have now asked me... Two people have now asked me what the Labour position is. I thought I expressed it right at the beginning, which is we are in favour of it, but it's not a blank cheque. We've got to have financial discipline on big things like these. We can't spend £42 billion on one project without considering all the other parts of the country that might need electrification and so on. So, of course, we are in favour. And, Matthew, you said, why don't we vote for it? Labour MPs this afternoon in the House of Commons voted for it.
Those that were there?
Well, I wasn't, because I was on my way here.
Yeah, well, no, there weren't very many. There weren't very... Right, now, I want to hear...
350.
Fine.
Not your leader and not your Shadow Chancellor, which is a bit of a...
But isn't this exactly what's now become wrong with this HS2? I mean, we're 2 years away from an election, and suddenly it's become a political football. So, you know, we have... Labour want to show the sort of voters in the South that actually they're good with money. So they're suddenly becoming very careful with money. And, you know, the Conservatives are desperate to woo voters in the North, so they are pushing for this train. I mean, why aren't we given a little bit more choice? If you have a large sum of money and you're trying to improve your life, surely you make a list of things that you possibly could spend it on. Why are we just being told this one thing?
I want to bring in just two or three members of the audience on the point that was raised about places that aren't directly in line with HS2, and then we'll go on to the next question. Yes, you...
Yeah, just to say, Mr Browne, I distinctly remember reading in the Liberal Democrats' last manifesto at the last general election that the Lib Dems were going to reopen disused rail lines that were closed down in the Beach Acts in the 60s. We don't need HS2 because we've got disused rail lines down here in Cornwall in rural areas like Harriet, St Austell that need to be reopened so that it gets people off the roads and away from using cars and using public transport, because I use public transport every day. It's late, it's expensive, God knows how much it costs the taxpayer paying for student rail cards and bus passes, but you need to reopen these disused rail lines, especially down here in other areas of the country, rather than spending billions of pounds of taxpayers' money on HS2 when you could just reopen the Victorian infrastructure that was used back then.
Thank you. And you sat there.
Yes, I think, just briefly, I think it's just another example of state-sponsored capitalism. And I think it's crony capitalism, and I think it's a folly.
OK. And you, sir, in the front here. And then I'll take one more point. The gentleman here in the front with the white jacket on.
I travel extensively in Western Europe on the high-speed trains, and quite frankly, I find it shameful that the UK has fallen so far behind when we invented the railway, and I fully support HS2, and I hope there are going to be more high-speed lines.
OK. And one last point for the man in the pink shirt up there, and then we'll go on.
Yeah, it's good to hear that money's been invested to create jobs, and you get people who say not in my backyard when it's running within a few miles of their home, and yet you get people saying it's not close enough to my home. But finally, I'd like to say it's interesting and quite comical to hear that Labour are at last pulling in the purse strings.
OK.
As you mentioned.
A question from Harry Samuels, please.
Are the bullying tactics used by Unite at Grangemouth justification for further restrictions on union activity?
There have been complaints about the way Unite acted in Grangemouth and a spat in the House of Commons about it, and the Prime Minister complaining about the behaviour. Should there be further restrictions on what unions can do? Harriet Sargent.
Well, I mean, what we've seen there is quite extraordinary. I mean, we've had a mother and her small children sort of besieged by the union members, standing outside with loudspeakers, telling this man's family, neighbours, neighbours' children, that this man is evil, having posters sent to his family saying that he's on the wanted list. And this is just a man who happens to be a director of a company, a company that also, I believe, is one of Labour's biggest financial supporters. So you sort of think, if that's how Labour's treating its friends, how's it treating its enemies? So I really believe that you can't possibly have this kind of behaviour. It's a dreadful advertisement for trade unionism, and that the politicians must condemn it.
What do you make of what Len McCluskey said, which is we need no lectures from Cameron, the original Bullingdon bully, and going on to say, complaining about faceless directors who make decisions to close down factories, put their families out of work. They need to understand they can't just disappear back into leafy suburbia.
Well, they're not faceless. They've got families, and those families are children under 5 who've been attacked.
All right. Chris Browne.
Yeah, I think Harriet's absolutely right that the bullying of families is not... Well, bullying is not on, full stop. And I think the kind of culture that sometimes that we have in Parliament, which looks like we're all bullying one another, doesn't help when teachers are trying to explain why bullying is bad in schools, actually. And I'm sure there are plenty who could say that I behave a bit like a bully in Parliament as well, so I accept my...
getting applause up there, yes.
But I do think that sometimes directors of companies need to understand that, in particular if they're big monopolies, they have a responsibility to society as well. I thought it was shameful this week that in the House of Commons, when you had the people from the big 6 energy companies, only one of them sent their chief executive. All of the chief executives should have been there. If you're in charge of the company, and frankly, if you're earning millions of pounds, and many of these people have doubled their wages in the last 2 or 3 years, then I think you have to take responsibility for your actions. And that means that sometimes you do have to be up there and out there and up front.
What did you make of the way that Unite handled the Grangemouth affair? Because it seemed to be they called the employers bluff, and then the employers called their bluff, and then everything was conceded just like that overnight. Was it a good negotiating tactic?
I've only ever been engaged in one similar kind of event, which is when Burberry wanted to close its factory in the Rhondda. And I was very opposed to it, and I campaigned very hard with the local assembly member, Leighton Andrews, and with the GMB, the trade union, because they represented the workers. And we always knew that there was a danger in the end that we'd have to sue for peace. And in the end, I went to the chairman and we did sue for peace. But we did manage, through that campaign, to quadruple the amount of support that was given to the workers in the factory. And we got £1.5 million given to the local community to set up a new charity.
Yeah, but talking about McCluskey...
it's just that...
Fine you talking about your experience there. Jack Straw, senior Labour member, says that Len McCluskey put internal union politics before the interests of their members.
Well,
do you agree with Jack Straw or with Len McCluskey?
The point I was going to make was that because I'm sticking with my point, I'm afraid, is
you could be courteous enough to answer mine.
Yeah, I'll try my best, David. I was going to say just that, which is, I think, an answer to your question, which is that I think it looks to me as if they overplayed their hand dramatically. And consequently, they would have been better to have done what we did in relation to Burberry and the GMB trade union, and I'm a proud trade union member. I will not have anybody try to deny that individual trade union members who pay their levies, who are normally tea ladies in schools and all the rest of it, have a perfect right to have their voice heard.
Right. Harriet.
Well, I'm a campaigner, and I do feel a lot of sympathy for the union in this, because they obviously just want to try and make some positive changes. But I think it's much better to focus on kind of positive engagement with people rather than the kind of tactics that they've used. And I think we see this again and again, don't we? Which is, you know, kind of groups that have got very good causes, you know, and their aims are quite noble, but then they use these kind of tactics that really don't win people over. But I guess in response to the question, do we need legislation? Well, you know, they're harassing this family or they're not. And I think, you know, we already have laws in place with that. And I think, you know, just to bring it on to press regulation as well, should we have press regulation? And it's like, well, we've already got laws in place, so why don't we just kind of, you know, enforce them?
Man in blue there.
The idea that we have these sort of faceless directors is poppycock when we have the faceless union executives who, in this case, nearly shut down a factory employing 800 people just because they wouldn't shift on their demands. It was down to, I read in the news, it was down to about a 50-50 vote on the matter. The idea that 51% and union executives who are putting pressure on their members to shut down a factory and make 800 people lose their jobs, I think is reprehensible.
And you asked the question, you asked the original question, do you think further restrictions on unions are required? I
think the idea of this, what Unite have called leverage, I think it's sickening, to be perfectly honest, that groups of thugs can go round and, as Harriet said, accuse these people of being evil and put wanted posters through the doors. So yes, I do think that these further restrictions need to be placed.
Matthew Hancock?
I think that this shows the tremendous gap between most trade union members who are hard-working and pay their dues and want to be represented, and the leadership, and in this case is a sort of extreme leadership. And I agree very strongly with what Harry said there, that holding to ransom a plant that is a tenth of the Scottish economy for political reasons is outrageous in order to have this internal debate within the Unite Trade Union and the Labour Party. And it's amazing that the man who is in charge of this and who led this action from Unite's point of view is still the chairman of the local Labour Party. It's extraordinary. So we've got to support union members, and I'm a strong supporter of trade unions, but when their leadership behave like this, then they need to look at themselves very hard in the mirror.
What frightens me is the next step the union are going to be is a branch of the Ku Klux Klan getting on anybody who they don't agree with and attacking their families. If they'd attacked me, I'd have been out there sorting them.
Can I just say, I think it's really easy to kind of condemn these kind of tactics, and they are wrong, but what about the kind of violence that the Tories are doing to, you know, people with mental health issues, people with disabilities, you know, like you say, people that wear suits and stuff are hurting the people of this country every day, and they're not getting condemned for it, you know.
Jeremy Browne.
Well, I support constructive trade unions, and they can make a real positive difference on behalf of the people they represent, and indeed on behalf of the company that they interact with. And if you look at, for example, the British car industry, it has gone from strength to strength. We're now manufacturing more cars in Britain than we've been doing for decades. And that is in part because the unions have had an enlightened, constructive attitude towards inward investment and the best interests of their members and the workforce. But that's very different from what's happened in this case. And I can only observe that the Unite Union is out of control and has let power go to its head. It's the biggest funder of the Labour Party. It selected its own candidate for Labour leader over and above the wishes of Labour members and Labour members of Parliament. And its behaviour generally, I agree with Jack Straw. I think that they are running out of control. They're trying to influence Labour selections. The Falkirk selection remains a sort of outstanding sore, unresolved by the Labour Party. And the unions have to get back to remembering what they exist to do, and that's to advance the day-to-day interests of their members. And I say, when they get that right, they can make a real positive difference. But for me, Unite have got it completely wrong.
But one thing they've got absolutely right is that you've got three politicians here and we are all virtually identical. We come from the same kind of background. We've got, two of us have got the same hair colouring even. And frankly, there are far too few working class MPs. And I absolutely support the campaign of Unite to try and get more working class people into Parliament.
But you don't boost that by going and intimidating people's children.
Of course you don't. And I've already said that I think that behaviour is absolutely reprehensible. But I do support trying to change the kind of people who get elected to Parliament, and that's what the Labour Party was originally founded to try and do, and we failed on that in recent years. I fully accept that. That's why I have an apprenticeship system in my office and all the rest of it. No, it's not, because you're attacking the whole basis of the trade union.
Maybe you should stand down in the ronda and make way for somebody more suitable.
Doubtless at some point I will.
I'll stand in your
I doubt it. You can stand in it. You can comment on these issues, as always, by text or Twitter. Our hashtag BBCQT. You can follow us at BBC Question Time. You can text comments to 83981. You can use the red button, of course, if you want to read what other people are saying. We'll move on to another question, because we've got many good questions here tonight. From Glyn Rowett, please. Glyn Rowett.
With wind turbines and solar panel fields impacting on our countryside, are we seeing any benefit in energy costs?
Yes, you've got, of course, wind turbines down here galore and solar panels coming, I think, in the West Country. Are we seeing any benefit in energy costs, which is the big issue of the month, I suppose? Jeremy Browne.
We're not seeing a direct benefit in terms of energy costs from wind generation, because it's a more expensive form of electricity generation than some of the alternatives. But I do think it's important that we diversify and modernise the way that we produce energy in this country. And I think 10 years, 20, 50 years' time from now, some of the countries in the world, the industrial world, will have made that transition and will have modern technologies which enable them to have the energy requirements they need for their industry and their households, but compatible with protecting their environment and the global environment. And others won't have made that transition. And it is important that we do make that transition. But all new technology, when it comes on tap, is in its early stages more expensive and gets developed and improved over time. And I'm not saying that, wind turbines or solar farms are the solution to all of our problems or all of our energy needs. And I think some of the solar farms in particular have been sited in bad areas, and they industrialise parts of the countryside in a way that I'm uncomfortable with, because I don't think they are farms in any recognisable sense. They are the equivalent of building a new housing estate on a field without having the benefit of people being able to live in the houses.
You'd rather have houses, would you, than solar panels?
Well, the regulation...
Or maybe houses with solar panels.
Well, if I was going to have fields of solar panels, I would rather have them on all new build houses to start with, and on factory roofs and other areas before I put them on arable land. But my point is that I think having a reasonable proportion of our energy mix from renewable sources is a desirable objective, and we should pursue that.
And to cut to the current issue, do you think it fair and right that energy consumers, domestic consumers, should be paying for these expensive ways of producing electricity at the moment in their own bills, week by week? Or would you like to see them funded by taxation?
Well, one way or the other, people will pay for them.
Well, hang on, that's not quite true.
Well, it is.
No, because if you don't pay income tax, you wouldn't pay for it.
No, but income tax only makes up a quite small proportion of the total taxation the government raises. But, look, I mean, I think there are a whole range of measures which are paid for. A lot of them are actually to do with loft insulation, for example, for people who have low incomes. I'm not doing a list. All I'm saying is that I think energy reduction is important as well, more efficient use of energy, the whole range of different measures to make us a better, more efficient country at how we use energy and how we generate energy, and this is part of that mix.
Can I just go back to the question before we go on, Glyn Rowett? What scale of wind turbines and solar panels are there here in the West Country? Are you exercised by?
Well, I'm in agreement of alternative source of power, but We see in Cornwall, especially on our beautiful countryside, there's a mass of wind turbines just going up. And more recently, these fields of solar panels. And all we do see is an increase in our energy costs. And we're not actually seeing any benefit as a ratepayer in this county, yet we seem to have masses and massive turbines and solar panel fields.
Matthew Hancock.
Well, wind farms are, we're told, are there to save the environment, but put them in the wrong place and they ruin the natural environment. So, you know, we've got to have a mix of energy supplies, but we've got to do it in a sensible way that's consistent with what people want locally, and where, if there is a development, then there's something in it for people whose view can be affected and, in some cases, ruined. And, you know, we've seen over the last few weeks the landing of a deal to build the first nuclear power station for years, which is low carbon, of course, and that will mean that it's cheaper than wind turbines, and if we get that going, then we won't need to build nearly so many wind turbines and ruin beautiful views that we have right across the country.
Paris Lees.
I tell you what, these companies are making a profit out of something that we all need. I think we would all agree now that you need heat, you know, you need electricity to watch this show. The gas isn't going to last forever. Why should anybody be making a profit out of something that we all need? You know, it doesn't make any difference to you when you turn the light on who provides your electricity, when you light up the stove, you know, it doesn't matter who's providing the gas. Why don't we renationalise it? And if we are making any profit out of it... and the trains and the NHS.
Man in the dark blue there.
I take my power from one of the smaller companies. They're actually based in Chippenham. They have 100% renewable energy. They have a wind farm at Delabol up in North Cornwall, and my bills have never been cheaper. And quite frankly, the renewable energy has already caught up, well, the rest of the market has already caught up with these 100% renewable providers.
So will you give us the name and address? Can we all, can we all get this wind-powered
Good Energy
electricity?
PLC, and they are based in
But I
Chippenham.
mean, will it reach... It won't get... Does it, well,
they distribute all across, as Paris said, it doesn't matter who provides your electricity, but you used to pay a premium, but the market is now capped.
Chris Bryant, can you get in the Rhondda?
I don't know, but you certainly get wind farms in the Rhondda, and there's been a lot of local opposition. I'm going to make myself very unpopular here now. I actually like the look of wind farms. I'm sorry, I find it quite sort of... and incidentally, I'm quite amused that this audience gave an enormous round of applause for renationalising everything. Len McCluskey will be delighted. But look, there are two serious things here. First of all, I think we have to take climate change absolutely seriously. Otherwise, there is a real danger that the world's waters are going to rise, and that's going to be a problem for the whole of the world. Secondly, you know, in the end, the energy that we're using at the moment is not renewable. It's going to run out. It's going to get even more expensive in 30, 40 years' time, so we have got to have other means of energy on stream. So I support all of that. But I think there are things that we could be doing about energy prices now. I think we could have a price freeze. That's what Labour's committed to and what we will do if we are elected in 2015 for 20 months. And secondly, I think we need to completely rejig not just the market in Europe on energy, not just in the UK, sorry, but across the whole of the UK, because energy prices in Europe at the moment are going down by 1.7%, whilst going up in the UK by 7.7% on average. But they're lower in the UK than they are elsewhere in Europe because the market there too is rigged. So I think we need a completely new approach to the way we organise the energy market across Europe.
Man with the spectacles there. No, the man with the spectacles there. Did you have your hand up? No. Oh, it's the woman behind you who had her hand up. I'm so sorry. It looked like it was your arm, it's her arm coming out of your shoulder. Yes. Strange.
The big six energy companies are essentially a cartel. They can charge whatever prices they like. They hold the consumer in utter contempt. They hold the House of Commons in utter contempt.
Yep.
They didn't even send their chief executives. And as Paris says, we have a situation where essential industries are essentially being run essentially for greed and profit. And everyone in this room is paying the price.
The woman in... Yes, in orange there. Yes.
We say we're looking at renewable alternatives. Why have we got a wave hub that's not been connected, and why are we not doing more about wave power when we're an island surrounded by water?
All right.
Agreed.
All right. Harriet Sargent, what do you make of the point that was made up there about this is a cartel? Do you think it's a cartel of the six big?
Yeah, well, I think actually it's not just the six big ones as well. I mean, first of all, I would just like to say that I was around when everything was nationalised, and I can tell you it was pretty dreadful. I mean, you know, you had to wait 6 months to get a phone line, the trains were awful, so I'm not a huge fan of nationalising everything again. But I also don't think that marketplace is working.
Matthew Hancock, as the representative of the government here, just briefly on those 2 points.
Yes.
Are the six a cartel, A, and B, are the offs generally not doing their job in energy?
Well, in energy specifically, today we heard the news we're going to have a competition review and look into the question of making the market more competitive. But I was about to agree with you, sir, because the answer to this is to go for the competitive new small energy companies, which often have lower prices. I, in fact, switched to one of these new smaller energy providers. And we're making it much, much easier to switch, because at the moment it can take weeks to switch, and we're going to bring that right down so that it's easy to switch. And so that instead of having a market where it's all extremely difficult...
to do anything to do with these people. You can't even get them on the phone.
Exactly.
Have you looked at a gas bill?
Exactly. And what we need to do is make it easier...
But can you understand your gas bill?
What we need to do is make it easier to switch in order for everybody to take that decision you did and go for what is the cheapest option, or the option that works best for them.
Can you just explain, then, why it is that the big six keep their prices so high? If you say you've switched to a smaller, cheaper place, why are the big six holding their prices 10% up this year when wholesale prices have gone up 1%?
Because I think that the big six don't think enough people are going to switch. So they don't think that it matters what happens. And that is a problem, and we've got to sort it out. And this big six thing is quite new. You know, 15 years ago, there were more than a dozen energy companies, and that dwindled and dwindled, and the big six arrived in just before 2010. And we've got to make sure we get more competitors so that more people can drive down prices and drive down the profits of these companies by allowing switching.
But we've also got to do something about the fact that the companies themselves are just too big because they're doing all the different elements of the market. And secondly, we've got to do something about senior executive pay in these industries where there's a monopoly. I think the chairman of Scottish Power now gets £10 million a year. The chief executive of E.ON, €4.2 million. And it's not that I'm saying people should never earn those kind of amounts. It's that what I'm complaining about is that whilst prices have gone up, their salaries have doubled. And that's not on.
So, you said an interesting thing from Labour, Sandra, like Peter Mandelson. You've no objection to people earning £10 million a year.
I think if somebody is really, really talented, in some industries it may be justifiable, but it is not justifiable when it's effectively a monopoly industry. It's not exactly a monopoly, but it's effectively...
No, it's not. How can one person's work be worth £10 million? What can anyone possibly do that's worth that?
If Pavarotti managed, when he was alive, to sell 10 million tickets for his opera, then I don't object to that. But what I do object to is when it's made out of enforcing price rises on ordinary people who will then have to make a choice between heating and eating.
Right, I'll take one more point and then we go on, you sir.
But a lot of the price increases are due to the government's green taxes. I mean, the regulator approved a 10% increase in the transmission cost of electricity. But most people here probably don't know that. You know, that's the reality of it. And, you know, it's all right to say renationalise things, but my God, I lived through... I remember walking along Southgate High Street and looking in the window to see when the lights went out. You know, so, you know, we'd love to renationalise things, Paris, but we can't afford it. We haven't any money, as a Labour cabinet minister said before he left government.
OK. All right, and you, sir, briefly, if you would.
Yeah, could Mr Hancock identify this smaller company, cheaper company that he's transferred to?
Oh, yes.
Well, as a member of
We'd all like to join it, then.
As a member of I'm not sure I want to advertise one of them. There's 7, actually, new companies since...
Well, your Prime Minister attacked Ed Miliband directly on the basis of the company that he'd gone to at Prime Minister's question, so I think you could tell the company...
There's 7...
Household hints.
It's called Ecotricity. There's 7 new companies that have started recently, and I think it's great that they should grow.
OK. We'll go on to another question. Sue McConnell, please. Sue McConnell.
Why is Chris Grayling in so much of a hurry to privatise our probation service that he is prepared to put the public at risk?
Paris Lees.
I made a very stupid mistake when I was 16 and I went to prison just a week after my 18th birthday. And thank goodness for the youth offending team and the probation service, which helped me get back on track. And I remember when I was inside that I think the statistic that was bandied about that something like 2/3 of first-time offenders would end up back inside within 2 years of being released. And that was really depressing, and it really made us feel that, you know, well, the odds are stacked against us. So I think for young people, you know, there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of rehabilitation. And I'm not saying that it's perfect, but the probation service do a very good job at the moment.
What did they do for you? What did you get from them?
They helped me back. They managed my transition back into society. They helped me find work. They helped me extend my curfew so that I could work as well as go to college in the daytime. Practical help. They help find a family member that you can go and live with. And they work really hard and they actually care about the people that they're working with. And my worry is that if we privatise it, when really have we privatised something where it's led to a greater service of people and more care for people? It just doesn't, you know?
Matthew Hancock.
The problem of repeat offending is an enormous one. And the chances of somebody coming out of prison and going back into prison are extremely high, and they're far too high. And making sure that we care for people properly and support them when they come out of prison is so important. For instance, that, you know, the delay from being released to getting your first benefit check often pushes people back into crime because they're desperate when they come out.
I think the question was why are you privatising the probation service, not what flaws are there.
No, and I'm answering the question because I think what Chris Grayling is doing and proposing is that people have support when they're in prison, and that support stays with the same people as they leave and then stays with them afterwards, and then the people who support them are then paid according to how successful they are at keeping people out of prison. And making sure that we get the incentives right on the probation service is really important, because the vital thing here is to follow the evidence of what works internationally, because crucially...
The evidence says that it's good and exceptional. No, there's been an assessment of the probation service around the UK, and overwhelmingly it's been ranked as good as an exceptional. But no one's talking about those words.
There are undoubtedly exceptional probation officers who work extremely hard. But the amount of people who go back into prison, having been in prison, is far, far too high, and we need to learn from around the world about what works to make sure people come out of prison and stay out of prison.
Yes, exactly the point. Can we just deal with the privatisation point? How is, if you say you want to give people an incentive to do better in the probation service, why can't that be done within the government-run probation service? Why does it have to be privatised?
Well, it can be done within any organisation that can provide the service and the level of care, and that's what's important.
Why can't the current probation service do that?
I'm sure that many people in the current probation service can, but what matters is not, you know, whether the probation service reports directly to the Justice Minister. What matters is whether it works in keeping people out of prison once they've left prison.
Harriet.
Well, I befriended this gang and I have known them now for about 5 years, and I knew them from when they were 16. And as they've gone through various systems, I've sort of seen things through their eyes. and one of them is the criminal justice system. And Paris has obviously had a very good experience of probation, but I have to admit that I haven't. And I have found that these young boys go to prison, they come out, and we must remember that under the age of 25, you have 75% reoffending rates within 1 year. Well, certainly my boys would have reoffended within the first day that they came out of prison, because when teenage boys go to prison, they get a lot to eat, they grow, and they've grown out of all their clothes. They would have robbed the very first day. And I didn't find the probation system at all helpful. They were just simply, I mean, for example, they'd have £40 when they came out of, and the probation just sends them all around the place. That £40 goes almost by the second day.
But Harriet, what is your impression of the effect of privatisation? What do you think it would be? I mean,
well, I am
you favour it?
I'm actually quite keen, because I last week went to see a charity that would be affected by this with St Giles Trust charity, who actually use a lot of ex-offenders in their charity to help mentor. And they would be one of the sort of charity who would be used for, and we must remember this is only low and medium risk. It's that the high-risk prisoners are remaining with probation. And they are going to go into the jails, and they will see them right at the beginning of their sentence. Because what goes wrong is that there's no sort of overall structure for these boys. They come out, there's nowhere for them to know where to job. So this is what will be done, and then they will be judged on whether they succeed.
The woman there on the left.
How do you think companies like G4S and Serco are going to take care of people, given their current practices that have been criticised?
All right, fine. Well, no, hold on, Harriet. I'll put the... It's a question... It's a question I'd like to hear Jeremy Browne on, because he was, until earlier this month, the Home Office Minister in the coalition of the Liberal Democrats, and presumably this issue came up. Were you in favour of it? And what's your answer to the lady there?
It's run by the Justice Department, not the Home Office, but there is obviously overlap, and I am in favour of it because, as a couple of members of the panel have already said, the biggest problem that we have to try and crack is reoffending, and we're up at about 75–80% reoffending rates for young men coming out of prison within a year, and obviously that's bad for those individuals because we want to try and rehabilitate them, we want them to make a constructive contribution to society, and it's bad for all of us because they may break into our houses or cars or whatever it might be. So this is an absolutely sort of crucial area that we as society need to try and get to grips with. And I think if we can find new imaginative ways to make probation services work better, more effectively, particularly for those categories of people, then why shouldn't we? Why do we think that one size fits all is the best solution? And I've been into prisons in the last year as a minister, and there's some very imaginative work being done. For example, there are large numbers of prisoners who have misused drugs, and some of the work being done with them so that they have a service which runs through from when they're in prison and on release, continues to support them when they're released, have had some very good results. There's been a lot of pilot studies in prisons about what can be done to try and help prisoners in terms of seeing their families more often in prison, and whether that reduces reoffending.
The issue is privatisation. Why? I mean, I want to go back to the question. Let me go. No, Harriet, hold on. I want to go back to the questioner who wants to come in on this. Are you getting the answers that satisfy you, or are you still?
I'm not, and I'm very tired. I'm very, very tired of hearing this coupling of the fact that we have an acknowledged and rated excellent probation service, and the government keep mentioning this problem with young men coming out of prison and reoffending, and their reoffending rates. The probation service, rated excellent and effective in its work, has never had responsibility for that group. So you have your little trial, you have your pilot, they do the work extremely well. And it's not fair to keep producing this statistic about young men coming out of prison when they have never been the responsibility of the probation service.
Chris Bryant.
I think the lady's absolutely right. There is clearly an issue about reoffending in the country. We all accept that, and successive governments have never managed to crack this. But in the end, I don't think that has anything to do with the privatisation of the probation service. And I say to Harriet and to Jeremy, who've talked very warmly about the work that certain charities have done, I just think charities should be the added bit They shouldn't be doing it instead of the government. But the probation service, and there are lots of reasons for reoffending. In my constituency, obviously, as every constituency MP gets, you get quite a lot of people who come through the door who you see 4 or 5 years later again and have problems. But the reasons for reoffending might have something to do with the fact that there's 1 million young people unemployed under the age of 25. It might have something to do with the fact that it's almost impossible for many people to get housing under the age of 25, and a whole series of social issues, and let alone our failure to deal with the massive drugs problem that there is in the country.
I want to go to Harriet.
Yes, I just thought this lady...
Harriet, yes.
I just thought this lady here asked a very good question that really put the finger on the point for what, for me, is the weak part of this, is that those big companies, GS4, that they are the only ones at the moment who can afford to invest up front. Because if you're going to judge a company by if they can stop someone reoffending within a year, you have to put a lot of work and a lot of money up front to do that. And so the small charities obviously can't do that, and that is definitely a weakness. And what I'm hoping is that those big companies will use the small charities, because you need to have individuals.
I think that's a little bit...
How does that foster
maybe me being too optimistic.
I mean, G4S did such a good job for the Olympics, didn't they?
No, I agree, it's a problem.
We've got 4 or 5 minutes left, so we'll go on to one more question. From Craig Lunt, please.
Is anyone served by the creation of a regulator which no journalists will subject themselves to?
This is, of course, very pertinent this week. The establishment of a royal charter agreed by the Queen and by everybody in the House of Commons and by no newspapers. What's the point of it all? Paris Lees.
I find myself in an awkward position quite a lot because I campaign for better media representation of transgender people. And I'm also a journalist, so I'm kind of trying to establish myself in a media that I'm also trying to critique and reform. And I can honestly say that the idea that this industry can regulate itself is like expecting a pack of wolves to kind of regulate its own hunt. It's just not going to happen, you know? Clearly, they're never going to sign up to something that the government's come up with, and you're never going to find a solution that's good for everybody. But there needs to be something. They've meant to be self-regulating for, 300 years, I read in the Daily Mail today. Well, it's just not working. Ofcom does it, television does it. You wouldn't be able to just say whatever you want on television. What makes newspapers so special? And can I say, actually, it's been really refreshing to see Ed Miliband taking on the Daily Mail. I was really surprised because people are so terrified of taking on these newspapers. And ever since that, in Prime Minister's questions, he's had real oak in his penis. I think it's done him the world of good.
Chris Browne.
Yeah, look, I mean, broadly speaking, I agree with Paris.
Including about the last bit.
You're obsessed, Matthew. I think, look, the most important thing for me is that I think ordinary members of the public know that the PCC, the system that we've had, didn't work. The people of Hillsborough were not served. They couldn't get a correction out of the Sun, could they? They couldn't use the courts because no criminal offence had been committed by the Sun when it said that people had that fans had stolen from dead people's pockets and all of that kind of stuff, all of which was completely and utterly untrue. They couldn't get a correction because the PCC, the system, just didn't work. So what I want is a very simple thing, which is a system whereby when newspapers have to correct it when they've got it wrong.
All right. Did you vote for the Royal Charter?
I can't remember whether there was a vote, but I've campaigned for this for so long now.
Do you think it's fair that under the Crime and Courts Act, yes, courts are told that publishers who don't belong to this Royal Charter, which none of them wish to belong to, will have to pay not only their own legal fees, but the fees of people who sue them and are found to have no case? But that everybody can sue them without any risk of losing money themselves. The proprietor will have to pay. Is that fair, or is that bullying the press?
I think, I mean, the press sometimes bully as well. And,
yes. Some of the most vulnerable members of society that don't have the money to take them to court, like these rich celebrities do.
Which is a very important point. And that's why I think it's important that what Lord Leveson tried to do and what the Charter tries to do is it simply tries to say that there should be a fair system, and it's up to newspapers whether they sign up to it, but there will be incentives for them to do so. The The incentive is that if they sign up to the Royal Charter system, then there will be a cheaper way of arbitration. All the hyperbole, the exaggeration, all the tosh that the newspapers have come out with in the last fortnight is, frankly, I don't think has done them any favours.
Harriet Sargent, we've only got a couple of minutes left.
OK,
so brief
I
if you
write
can.
for the Daily Mail and the Sunday Times, so I am not on these people's side. I mean, I think we should judge institutions by how they deal with their scandals. And we have had scandals in the press.
What about the Mail?
That is all clear. But how have they dealt with their scandals? Well, what do we have this week? We have 2 editors on trial. We have 8 journalists on trial in the courts. The News of the World no longer exists.
Careful,
no,
careful when you talk about
this. Let us just look how other institutions have dealt recently with their scandals. Let's look at the BBC. Let's look at bankers. Let's look at the NHS. Well, what happens there? I mean, are there people, when their things happen, are their rotten apples, are they in jail? Are any of them on trial? I don't think so.
All right. Well, Jeremy Browne, Harriet, we've really got to come to an end because we're over our time.
I'll respond directly to that point. I'm in favour of free speech, free expression, free press. But it's not a completely unconditional freedom. And that freedom comes with responsibilities as well. And we also ought to protect weak people, vulnerable people, from the effects of the powerful. And the powerful can be the state, it can be companies, but it can be groups of organisations, including newspapers. And the winds of change are blowing through large parts of our country. We know it in Parliament, where it's happened, and it's happened in trade unions and elsewhere. And the days of everybody sort of self-regulating and don't you worry about it too much, and we're not going to have any transparency or openness, I think those days are going, not just in the media, but across the board, in services, in companies, as I say, in Parliament. And I think the media have to realise that they have responsibilities as well.
I have to move you on. Thank you. Matthew Hancock, the stalemate is between a royal charter on the one hand and a press who says they'll have nothing to do with it. What's going to happen?
Well, I think that what the public want to see is the press freedoms that we have had for years and that rightly are there to make sure that politicians are held to account, that our country is run in a fair and transparent way as possible, but with safeguards to make sure that the vulnerable are protected and that victims are supported and that those who can't fight back have a voice in this. But I would not want that to overrule the fact that we have a fantastic thing in Britain, which is we stand up to the overmighty, we fight back against a hierarchy, and it's that freedom that the press argue so passionately for, that even though it affects me negatively as a politician, because they have a go at all politicians...
And exposed all your expenses.
Absolutely. They exposed the expenses which wouldn't have happened without a free press, and that makes me proud to be British.
Yeah, but what's not said is that actually the press are the hierarchy. We're talking about 500 of the most elite, pampered, privileged, overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly heterosexual, old boys' club that all went to Eton and Cambridge. And they're
Sorry, are you talking about the BBC or the NHS?
The whole of the media.
On which
I just wish the Prime Minister would do it occasionally.
On which point we really must stop. Our hour is up. Next week we're going to be in Boston, in Lincolnshire. It's the town with the highest proportion of Eastern European immigrants anywhere in the UK. And we'll have Nigel Farage of UKIP there. And Anna Soubry for the Tories and the poet Benjamin Zephaniah among the panellists. The week after that we're going to be in Brighton, and if you can come either to Boston or to Brighton. The rules are always the same. The number on the screen, 0330 123 99 88, or the website. And you can apply either way. If you're listening to this on BBC Radio Live, the debate goes on, of course, as you now know, on Question Time, Extra Time. But from us here, my thanks to our panel, to all of you who came here to take part in the programme. From St Austell, until next Thursday, good night.
So the debate continues with Question Time, Extra Time on BBC Radio 5 Live now. Or stay with BBC One as Andrew Neil discusses HS2 with opponent Stanley Johnson on This Week